So I want to begin by thanking everybody who's attending both online and in the room, and begin by introducing our speakers. And then the format is going to be, we're going to have each of our speakers give their presentation. I've asked people to speak for 10, maybe 15 minutes maximum as sort of opening comments. And then we'll move into a question and answer phase, and that will involve both people in the room and also people who are watching online, as Michael's explaining through the chat function. We're expecting we'll wrap up somewhere between 2:30 and 3, depending on how questions go. So our speakers today are all individuals who are involved in fairly direct ways with the processes that we're discussing. As we know, I think everybody knows in the room, this conversation goes back to the previous federal government under Stephen Harper, and in particular, its rewriting of federal environmental assessment, of federal environmental legislation through Bill C-38, and specifically the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, the National Energy Board Act, the Fisheries Act, and the Navigable Waters Protection Act, which became the Navigation Protection Act. In the 2015 election campaign, the Liberals made fairly extensive commitments around reviewing and reforming these processes. We've had now an expert panel report specifically on the environmental assessment dimension of things. Another expert panel has reported on the National Energy Board side. There have been parliamentary committee reports on the Navigation Protection Act and the Fisheries Act. And in June, there was a discussion paper issued by the Government of Canada, sort of outlining some directions in terms of where they think this is heading. So far as we know at this stage, specific response now is being considered within the Government of Canada, potentially quite literally as we speak, and legislation is anticipated shortly. And it's in that context I've invited our 5 speakers to join us today. And I'm going to ask Anna Johnson from West Coast Environmental Law to speak first. She is staff counsel with West Coast Environmental Law, where she focuses on building the next generation of environmental assessment law. She is co-chair of the National Environmental and Planning Assessment Caucus of the Canadian Environmental Network and sits on the Multi-Interest Advisory Committee appointed by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change to assist with the federal review of Canada's environmental assessment process. So Anna, do you want to start off, please? And do you have a PowerPoint?
I do. Yeah,
okay.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Good, thank you.
And thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. So I'm going to, okay, I think I'm sharing my screen. Is it success?
Yeah, I'm getting thumbs up from the technical side, so I think it's working.
Awesome. All right, so I am going to talk about where we're at, where I think we're at now with the review of federal environmental assessment processes. I'm going to start with a little bit of context to give a bit of background for what NextGen EA is and how we're comparing what's in the discussion paper and what we see coming from government against NextGen EA. And then I'm going to give an overview of the discussion paper as it pertains to environmental assessment reform, and then provide some recommendations for stopping the gaps. So as some of you may know, West Coast hosted an EA Reform Summit last May. We had experts from across Canada, over 40 experts from industry, environmental groups, academia, come and discuss what are the key elements of next generation environmental assessment, building on some of the deep thinking that a number of academics across Canada had begun to do. The outcomes of that summit were 12 pillars of next generation environmental assessment. I'm not going to go into them, but I will be using those as the basis for my analysis of the discussion paper and my recommendations. We did have a second EA Reform Summit this June that went into further detail about how to implement these 12 pillars. So as Mark noted, in addition to the summit, an expert panel was appointed by the feds to review federal EA processes. It did a rigorous cross-country consultation process with Indigenous peoples, the public, industry, and other groups, and in April released its report Building Common Ground, which largely reinforced the outcomes of our EA Summit. So those are two of the main reference points that I'm using for my analysis of the discussion paper. So when the discussion paper was released, we were not thrilled. West Coast came out with a report card of it and gave it an overall grade of C-. I will note that a lot of the issues that we see in the discussion paper aren't necessarily because it's very bad, but it's quite high level and in a lot of cases can be read as going in a number of different directions. So while my critique of it is not overly favorable, I will note that there's quite a lot of room for there to be Next Gen EA as an outcome of this review still. So the first main section of the EA section of the discussion paper talks about addressing cumulative effects. It's largely positive, but there's a lot of work left to do. So it mainly talks about the need to develop national environmental frameworks and to make greater use of strategic and regional assessments. The problem with the section is there's no mention of establishing a legislative framework for regional or strategic assessments. So it implies, or the worry is that it could be relying on the goodwill of governments to conduct them. And we've had the ability under SIA 2012 to do regional studies. We haven't seen any done, and so in order to ensure that we actually are focusing our attention much more on the regional and strategic levels, what Next Gen EA principles say is that there needs to be a legislative framework. And connected with that, there's also no mention in the discussion paper of connecting or tiering regional and strategic assessments with project level assessment decisions or regulatory processes. So Next Gen EA principles say that the legislation should require that project level EA and regulatory decisions must be consistent with the outcomes of regional and strategic assessments. Otherwise, they could be essentially hollow exercises. And then finally, while there's mention of strategic assessments of national environmental frameworks, the discussion paper is silent on the need for strategic assessments of broader policy gaps. For example, issues that have come up in recent pipeline assessments about climate change and our trajectory towards a climate-safe future, nor is there mention of legislating strategic assessments of government plans, policies, and programs, which is currently housed under the Cabinet Directive and largely being ignored by government. Next, the discussion paper talks about early engagement and public participation in two different sections. These are largely positive. There are some concerns, especially with early engagement. So what the government is proposing to do is to develop an early planning and engagement phase before what is currently considered to be the beginning of assessment phases. This is really good news. It's something that groups like the Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus and many others have been calling for. There is a caution around that I'll get to a little bit later. It talks about the need for direct engagement between the Crown and Indigenous peoples with regards to public participation. They're proposing to eliminate any barriers to public participation, to increase funding for public and Indigenous participation, and to provide greater transparency through access to information, detailed reasons for decision, open and transparent databases. So those are all, it's quite good news. There are some gaps. One problem in the discussion paper is that it says that this engagement planning phase is to be led by proponents, which the Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus, as well as the Multi-Interest Advisory Committee, have both recommended that the planning phase be led by the government in order to provide greater assurance to the public and clarity through the process and oversight. It's also silent on how public participation processes should be designed. So one key function of this engagement or assessment planning phase should be that the public is involved in designing how they want to be engaged in environmental assessments. It also doesn't mention any right of appeal or an appeals tribunal to ensure that the public has a right to take action on governments if they're not upholding their obligations under the law. It then goes to talk about science, evidence, and Indigenous knowledge. Again, the discussion paper seems to be going in a positive direction. There's some clarification needed. So one of the proposals it makes is to have an open science and data platform, which has been recommended by a number of different groups and individuals. It talks about the need to better incorporate Indigenous knowledge. Happily, it does recommend peer reviews of science and evidence, which is another thing that many groups were requesting, including West Coast. And then tying back to better transparency for the public, it proposes making plain language summaries available of environmental assessment information so that the public doesn't have to retain experts to go through tens of thousands of pages of dense data. One caution is around that recommendation to better incorporate Indigenous knowledge. I'm aware of concerns within Indigenous communities of the term incorporation, that it risks subsuming Indigenous knowledge into Western worldviews and continuing the practice of having Western science be deemed to be more valid than Indigenous knowledge. And so I think there needs to be greater clarity about how the government intends to braid the two together and give both equal respect and weight. There's also no mention in the discussion paper of continuing on as the Multi-Interest Advisory Committee, nor of the establishment of a non-interest-based technical advisory committee, which is something that we have been recommending in order to ensure that there's greater attention on regional and strategic assessments, what should get assessed, and guidance for the agency. And then finally, the discussion paper talks about impact assessment, which is probably the most concerning section of the discussion paper with regards to EA. So it does say, basically it says, let's broaden the scope of assessment to include social, economic, and health considerations and include gender-based analysis plus. So that it's tempting to see that as a positive thing. However, there's nothing in the discussion paper about setting up a legislative framework to ensure that now that you're filling the basket full of more things to consider, that the economy doesn't continue to trump environmental well-being. So there's nothing in there about a decision-making framework to ensure environmental safeguards are in place and that decisions have to select the option that will result in the greatest amount of well-being to the environment, to communities, and to the long-term economy, and avoid any serious trade-offs. The discussion paper also confusingly in this section both proposes that a single agency be responsible for impact assessments, but then it also says that assessments will be conducted jointly between the EA agency and the life cycle regulators, the National Energy Board, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, as well as now it's throwing offshore energy boards into the mix. And it appears in the discussion paper that not only is it saying that assessments should be jointly conducted, but in fact, assessments and regulatory processes should be merged together. So that's quite concerning because we've had a lot of commentary come out of EA experts about how it's important for the functioning of assessment to really be as a planning process, that it be kept separate from regulatory processes and that the regulators be limited to an advisory role. There's also a sole reliance on a project list, so continuing with the existing SIA 2012 approach to only assessing the types of projects that are in a narrowly defined list. No mention of going back to old triggers. So right now we're only assessing less than 1% of federally regulated undertakings that have impacts on the environment. So that's concerning if we're not going to cast that net more broadly. And then it also recommends or suggests staying with legislative timelines. So how to stop some of these gaps, how to make sure that federal EA reform lives up to the standard of Next Gen EA. First, it's important to remember that environmental assessment is an integrated package, and that if you want it to function as it can to fully realize its potential, that the whole suite of reforms of next generation EA processes need to be implemented. These aren't comprehensive, they're just the key ones based on the gaps that I've pulled out of the discussion paper. So first of all, the government will need to legislate a sustainability decision-making framework to ensure that decisions can't allow trade-offs, unacceptable trade-offs like significant adverse environmental harm, unless in clearly defined and justified circumstances that the public is allowed to see. And then casting a wider net on what gets assessed. So going back to some kind of triggering process, ensuring that projects that have impacts on the environment are registered and understood, and that collectively the government is looking at those and ensuring that we're still making progress towards sustainability. The legislation should set out a framework for regional and strategic assessments, including triggers for when they're conducted, a basic framework for process requirements to ensure that leading edge processes are applied, meaningful public participation, etc. And then, as I mentioned before, ensuring that project level decisions are consistent with the outcomes of regional and strategic assessments. The legislation should also acknowledge Indigenous jurisdictions and require obtaining their consent throughout processes and in decisions. It should also require that projects be consistent with their climate goals. Achieving a 1.5 degree world will mean that we really have to bend our minds to how that happens at the project level. Removing EA authority from the life cycle regulators and clearly defining the assessment process as a separate process from regulatory processes. Ensuring decisions are not made by Cabinet where they get to be made behind closed doors, and Cabinet has the authority to not provide transparent reasons for decision, whether that's at the ministerial level or by an expert authority as the EA expert panel proposed. And then also the legislation should establish a right of appeal of both process decisions in the interim and assessments and then all final decisions. So those are some of the key issues that need to be addressed in order for this legislation to meet its full potential and the government's obligations or its commitments that it made on the campaign trail. And just in a closing note, we've been saying, and the government, I think, has been acknowledging to some degree that this really is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. As Minister McKenna stated at the EA Summit in 2016, this is a legacy law, and we need to get it right. So we're expecting to see legislation by the end of this year or early next year, and I think we'll have some work to do at the committee stage, but I'm somewhat confident still that we'll get a good package by the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. It's very interesting, a very, very good overview of the discussion paper and where we seem to fit. I should know you mentioned a number of dimensions of the Indigenous dimension of this conversation. I should mention that we did reach out to a number of Indigenous organizations, invited them to participate, and we were, I think, just defeated by scheduling conflicts and demands on those folks' time, which has become very, very intense. Our next speaker will be Aaron Flanagan. From the Pembina Institute. Adam, can we switch over? And Aaron is director of the Pembina Institute's federal policy program, and in that role, she spearheads the national policy campaigns on climate and energy issues, including carbon pricing, electricity sector regulation, and environmental law reform. She supports the Institute's regional priorities in Ottawa as well. She researches approaches public policy solutions that reduce the environmental impact of fossil fuel development and support Canada's transition to clean energy. Aaron.
Great.
Yep,
can you hear me okay?
Yep, we're good. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So, great. Thanks so much for having me here today. It's good to get the gang all back together. We did have a similar webinar when this process first began, but as Mark and Anna have both said, there's been a lot of progress and a lot of change since we last spoke, so lots to go through. I'd like to start with a little bit of history in terms of how the NEB was first conceived and some of the real foundational challenges that the board is currently working to address, and part of the foundational reason why we need significant reform to not just to the Environmental Assessment Act, but also to the National Energy Board itself. So it was established in 1959. It had a mandate explicitly in its inception to accelerate the development of Canada's oil and gas resources. And so, it was really conceived of in a time when that was seen to be Canada's predominant national interest, or at least part of it. And the institution itself predates many other important laws and important organizations in terms of environmental protection. So that's
Erin, if I could interrupt for a sec, could you try the screen share again? Because we're not seeing your slides yet.
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
There we go.
Awesome.
Good, thank you.
Okay, well, you didn't miss much, just on slide 2. So the NEB was conceived of in an era that is very much unlike the one that we are in today, and that's part of the reason why the board has been subject to a great deal of conflict over the last few years. So unpacking what the NEB is today, I think, is important so we better understand how the board itself can be reformed. So it is meant to have a quasi-judicial structure. It currently has a mandate to make decisions and to regulate the life cycle of interprovincial and international power lines, as well as designated pipelines, rather, as well as designated power lines. It is currently the responsible authority for the SEIA 2012 Environmental Assessment Act. So it is currently the body that is conducting those EAs, though I think many on this webinar and in this environmental law community would say that they're not true EAs. They're more like regulatory reviews. And it also issues a certificate of public convenience and necessity. It makes recommendations to the governor and council, to cabinet, who ultimately make the final decision on individual projects. When the board is issuing a certificate, it considers a number of factors. This is text from section 52 of the Act, and it looks at the following items. It looks at the availability of oil and gas or other commodities for the pipeline. It looks at the existence of markets, actual or potential. It looks at the economic feasibility of a project, the financial responsibility and the financial structure of the proponent, and then this broad category, any public interest that in the board's opinion may be affected by the issuance of a certificate. So quite a lot of wiggle room there, and also you'll see in some of the words that I've underlined here, a bit counter to really understanding and unpacking global commodity changes as it relates to climate change. It's part of the reason why the board, in our view, has not been able to really step up and make better decisions as the world transitions to low carbon, because its mandate in the structure of its own legislation, there's some barriers there that prevent it from really meaningfully understanding and assessing climate change. But it's also a life cycle regulator, and that's a really important function of the board. So it doesn't just look at the environmental assessment phase, it also looks at the project through its life cycle. It regulates traffic tolls and tariffs. It looks at international trade of energy, and it also provides an important advisory role in that it produces important information, energy statistics, and data, which are later used by the proponent in terms of making the case for its project. But they're also used, this data is also used by policymakers as they're thinking about energy policy or climate policy. And so it informs our work as well. So very important function that they have there around data. So there are a couple things that are really challenging this mandate, as I've alluded to. So the first is that, of course, the environmental impact assessment is scoped to assess one project. And so when we're thinking about pipelines in particular, but also transmission lines, issues of cumulative impacts become paramount, and presently those are not well managed. It's part of the reason why we've seen a significant amount of public conflict surrounding new infrastructure development, though of course issues of reconciliation are also foundational to some of that conflict. So it's not just climate, but that is part of what I think is accelerating some of those conflicts. And you know, the Paris Agreement has produced a new global norm around climate action. The Paris Agreement, as Anna alluded to, 1.5 degree temperature limit, it outlines and has, you know, global consensus around a new level of ambition in terms of tackling climate change. And that requires a change to our analytical baseline. And so far, we haven't seen that the board, in its capacity as energy statistics provider, has been able to step up to this new challenge. So in terms of influencing this process and feeding in our input, we at the Pembina Institute produced a report last year that looked at opportunities for reform and also outlined our vision in terms of what we think the National Energy Board should do and should look like at the conclusion of this review process. So in a nutshell, we've got a few vision statements that we hope we'll see at the end of this process. We think that regulators should reflect the values of the society in which they operate, that regulators should support Canada's commitment to the Paris Agreement, that they should conduct their work in the spirit of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, that they should be accessible to the public, and they should make evidence-based decisions, they should be free from bias, and that they should aspire to be world-leading and to deploy predictable, rigorous, and inclusive practices in terms of managing natural resources and managing infrastructure. We have a couple specific recommendations that I'd like to focus on, and there'll be a little bit of overlap with what Anna said, but hopefully I can provide a few more additional details as well on a few of these items. So we've already talked about strategic and regional assessment. So of course, we have been really taking guidance from the environmental law community and legal experts who strongly recommend that the federal government use its capacity to conduct strategic and regional assessments. So that's been part of our recommendation as well. That's really important in terms of setting that vision and establishing regional thresholds so that the rules of the road are better understood by proponents. As part of that, we have recommended a strategic impact assessment on climate change, and particularly that be scoped around both the Paris Agreement and Canada's mid-century low greenhouse gas strategy. This is a strategy that is not well known or well understood. It was released last year at COP22 in Marrakesh, Morocco. Canada was actually one of the first countries in the world. We did this jointly with the United States and Mexico to release a policy document that looked at 2050 and how we need to bend the curve of our greenhouse gas emissions to achieve the Paris Agreement and to make a fair share contribution towards the Paris Agreement. So it looks at greenhouse gas reductions on the order of at least 80% below 2005 levels by 2050, and it actually looks at some scenarios that are more ambitious than that. And our recommendation is that a strategic impact assessment on climate change absolutely should be conducted, and that further, it should be scoped around these longer term obligations and not so much around 2030, which is the current target that we have under the UN, which gets a lot of attention and has really been central to the federal, provincial, territorial negotiations on the Pan-Canadian framework. So this is a tool that already exists in terms of the capacity to conduct strategic impact assessments. There is a cabinet directive, as Anna referred to. And this will really help, I think, address a fundamental challenge that Canada faces, which is reconciling energy infrastructure decisions and current policies like the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change with the longer-term energy transition that we as a nation are going through, and also all other nations are reconciling as well. So that's how we think the strategic SIA should be conducted going forward. We've also recommended that the National Energy Board, of course, no longer be the responsible authority for the Act, so that the Environmental Assessment Act be led by the agency or whatever comes next in terms of the reform process, but that the National Energy Board, in our view, could provide technical expertise. With also, of course, that the EA should test for contribution to sustainability, and that decision makers should provide detailed reasons. On the data side, we think it's really important that a new reference case be produced. So these are the scenarios that the National Energy Board currently produces in terms of supply and demand for oil, gas, and coal. And this information right now is not consistent with those temperature limits in the Paris Agreement. So we think it's absolutely essential that this review process deliver a reference case that actually considers domestic and international action on climate change and has a commensurate reform in terms of the supply and demand scenarios for Canada's fossil fuels. We also hope that through this process, we can see more harmonized data, that data can be more accessible and can be really, frankly, more useful to policymakers, to academics, and those of us who are attempting to move forward new policies. And here's just a quick slide that demonstrates why this is so important. So this is from the Energy Futures publication that was put out last year. It has recently been updated, but this is from last year's version. And so you can see that over 2015 to 2040, the National Energy Board was predicting significant increases in Canada's crude oil production, including oil sands and natural gas. But when you contrast that with other credible international bodies like the International Energy Agency, you're seeing a really different set of assumptions around how 2050 is going to play out. So they're saying globally, coal is going down by 68%, oil is going down, gas is going down, right? So we're not aligning our data with the international community, and as a result, we are approving infrastructure for a 6-degree world or a 4-degree world when perhaps that's actually not in our long-term national interest. We've also recommended that public participation be improved so that they remove the provision that participants who are only directly affected can be considered in the process, and that they create other ways to get involved, that they establish an independent advocate for landowners and the public. So in terms of the discussion paper, so there are lots of different pieces to dig into there. I think that from our perspective, there was actually quite a bit to be optimistic about, though I absolutely take Anna's point that it was lacking detail, and that was really our predominant piece of feedback to the federal government. So we certainly appreciate the reference that the government will conduct strategic assessments, that they'll broaden the scope, that they will establish this single agency, that they will improve the data platform and bring in an open science and data platform, and that they will take an open by default approach to participation. But we have some questions in terms of what this really looks like. And at this point, our demand to the federal government is really that they provide better information, better details around what each of these will look like, so that we have assurances that the recommendations that we and so many others have made will be reflected in the final legislative solution. On the issue of joint review panels, because it's quite important, we have put forward recommendations with West Coast Environmental Law that we think provide a more workable solution in terms of how joint review panels could potentially be used. So our view is that the reformed Environmental Assessment Agency should be solely responsible for administering the Environmental Assessment Act for all projects, including projects that would be subject to a joint review or that currently are under the purview of the National Energy Board. And we further think that the EA agency should act as a secretariat for all reviews, including the joint review panels. This means that there would be a certain level of consistency and fairness in terms of the type of assessment that each project receives, and we think that's a really important outcome for this process. Further, we've recommended that the legislation should not prescribe the panel composition if they do use joint review panels as a solution, and that the Minister of Environment and Climate Change should retain the ability to appoint those panel members. In our view, the life cycle regulators, including the National Energy Board, could provide a roster of experts for the minister to consider in terms of appointing members to those panels. So we absolutely recognize that the National Energy Board has a certain amount of expertise on energy issues and life cycle regulation, and that is really important for certain types of projects. So they could be those names of individuals could be put forward on a roster, and the minister would retain the ability to include those individuals to the extent that he or she felt it was important for the review process. We've recommended as well that all panel members should be independent of the government in the same fashion that the agency appointed panels are currently conducted. So the roster of experts, in our view, should not be experts currently housed within the National Energy Board, but should in fact be independent experts, and could be ex-regulators or ex-energy sector experts, but should not currently be housed within the National Energy Board, so shouldn't be, current hearing commissioners, for example. And of course, this idea of an early assessment planning phase, we absolutely think that should move forward, and that we think that life cycle regulators could sit on these groups to provide their expert advice. And there could be, through the secretariat process, a way in which to really harness information from that early assessment phase and feed that information into the joint review process to ensure that those lessons learned and the data collected at that time ultimately has bearing on the environmental assessment. So in terms of next steps, so as I mentioned, we're looking for more details on the intended path forward. So this question of open by default for public participation, will that include the establishment of a public intervener's office or some sort of independent agency that is enshrined in legislation, has some budget to actually support landowners and the public? We don't know whether or not that will be part of the solution. We also don't know whether this open science and data platform will ultimately enable Paris compliant decision making. So we're looking for more details on that, and specifically how the current energy statistics function that lives within the board, how that will evolve and how that will potentially take into account the Paris Agreement. And this question of strategic impact assessment on climate change, so will that be conducted? We don't know at this point. If it is conducted, how will it be scoped? And how will it impact project-specific reviews? So a lot of unanswered questions there. And I will leave it at that and look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Erin. That's great. That's very informative. I mean, what really struck me is how dramatically the context within which the NEB is operating has changed in the last few years relative to the preceding 50 or 60. I mean, I often tell my class that the last time there was a debate about a pipeline in this country was before everybody in this room, including me, was born. And it just sort of speaks to how much that context has shifted, but the structure and role and approach of the board hasn't caught up with the extent to which the issues it's confronted with have just changed at a fundamental level. Speaking of change at fundamental levels, our next speaker is Rick Lindgren with the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and I've asked him specifically to speak about the role of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in this process. And I'm quite sure that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's preference in this process was that we had forgotten about it completely and that nobody mentioned it. We're making sure that didn't happen. Indeed, I had the interesting experience the day I presented to the expert panel on environmental assessment reform here in Toronto was the day the folks came down from Tiverton and Bruce to talk about their experiences with the CNSC and the Deep Geological Repository. And that was, to say the least, a very interesting series of presentations. The folks from Ontario Power Generation thought everything was great. I'm not sure anybody else did. Rick is very well positioned to speak to this. He's represented individuals, public interest groups before tribunals and courts, including the CNSC, and has been involved in numerous undertakings subject to federal or provincial environmental assessment requirements. He served as counsel for Walkerton residents at the Walkerton Inquiry and has been a member of the Ministry of the Environment's Advisory Panel on Environmental Assessment. So Rick, do you want to, we're taking a different step here. We're actually going to have a live presentation as opposed to a web-based one. So I'm going to give the podium to Rick. We have a PowerPoint as well, right?
Yes, I'll switch that. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Mark. Like we're still doing some technical work here. And I have to say, Mark did ask me to, well, let me back it up a step. Last night, of course, was Halloween, so Mark asked me to speak about something dark and mysterious. So I picked Federal EA of nuclear projects. So hope not too many of you will be scared. Oh, how do I advance the slides? I'm old school.
So am I. Hang on. See, we are challenged by having an actual live person in the room.
Sorry, I'll go back home.
So, okay, let me. Okay, so there's that. Now this. Okay. All right.
There we go.
So now you
Got
can
it.
just use the
There we go.
keyboard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
The technical difficulties. So the first thing I want to do is give a shout out to my sponsor, the Canadian Environmental Law Association. As some of you know, we've been around for about 45 years and counting. And over that time frame, we've spent a lot of time dealing with various nuclear facilities and nuclear activities. And based on that experience, this is our overall conclusion in terms of federal environmental assessment reform. Number one, SEA 2012 is broken, can't be fixed. Number two, we think there's a compelling need for a new statute that's focused on sustainability for the reasons described by Anna a few minutes ago. And thirdly, it's our position that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission should not lead, co-lead, or decide environmental assessments under the new regime. We agree with the expert panel's recommendation that an independent commission should be conducting the assessment and making the decisions at the end of the day. And it's really that third proposition that I want to focus on for the remainder of my presentation. But first I want to set the stage a little bit. Here are some facts and figures about the nuclear context here in Canada. As you can see, we have a number of operating reactors. We have uranium mining and milling going on. We have lots of industrial and commercial and medical uses of nuclear substances and lots of transportation of nuclear substances. And we also have storage of different types of nuclear waste at different types of facilities, both on-site and centralized repositories. So my takeaway point here is not to scare you, but just to indicate that this is not, the nuclear sector is not a small scale or localized or insignificant industry. It's something that's out there and needs to be looked at very carefully for the obvious reasons. So how is the nuclear sector regulated right now? Well, the centerpiece really is the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. It's an independent regulatory body that's been around since 1997. It administers the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, or NASCA. And the commission issues or amends or refuses licenses to various applicants. They set regulatory standards, they monitor and report upon compliance. So they play a very important role in terms of regulating the nuclear industry across Canada. But under SEA 2012, the Commission also plays an important role in the sense that it has been given exclusive responsibility to conduct environmental assessments for certain nuclear projects. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but essentially we have a list under SEIA 2012 which prescribes or designates certain types of projects that require federal environmental assessment. As I'll get to in a few moments, that list is surprisingly small and it's confined to the biggest of the big projects. So that's the status quo. And really, when the expert panel was first appointed to look at environmental assessment in detail, it looked at the status quo and it asked itself a number of key questions. Is the status quo adequate? Is it robust? Is it sufficiently participatory and evidence-based? Do the agencies or entities leading the EA process, do they enjoy sufficient public trust? And really, the whole object of the exercise, according to the minister, when this expert panel was set up, was to make sure that the reformed EA process regains or restores that public trust. So that's what the expert panel was out to determine. And as I indicate on this slide, a number of people across Canada participated in the consultations carried out by the panel, and a number of them did raise a number of what I would call evidence-based concerns about the willingness or the ability of the Commission to carry out robust and fair and credible EA exercises. There's also concern expressed by some of these stakeholders that the problem of regulatory capture had occurred, that the Commission was too close or too cozy with the regulated industry, and that created a bit of a perception perhaps of bias or of preordained outcomes, that the Commission was inclined to give a pass to these projects that have to go through the EA process. And again, that's not just my word, that's not just CELA's perspective, that's what the expert panel heard, and I invite you to take a look at the expert panel report. I've given you the page numbers. That's where they document a number of the concerns that were raised during the consultations. So if that's what the panel heard, what did they recommend? Well, the overarching objective, as I said, was to restore public trust. And to do that, the expert panel said we need a new, independent, quasi-judicial expert commission to not only conduct environmental assessments, but also to make the penultimate or ultimate decisions on whether the project should be approved or not. That was a radical move, I would say, and kind of a bold step, but it's one that we certainly support at CELA. And under this model, if it's implemented, the independent commission would conduct the EA, and it would ask and answer a lot of the key EA questions. You know, what is the project to be assessed? What are the factors to be considered? What are the cumulative impacts? What is this the preferred alternative from a reasonable range of alternatives? Are there better alternatives that might get at the same problem but at less cost or less risk? And ultimately, does this project make a net contribution to sustainability? Those are EA questions, and they are best addressed and best answered by an independent commission. Now, having said that, I think a lot of us recognize the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has been around for a long time. It's acquired a certain amount of technical and regulatory expertise. That's relevant, and it should be heard. And so under this model, the new commission would conduct the EA, but the CNSC staff and other federal ministries, departments, and agencies who also have some relevant expertise to bring to bear, they would be participants in the EA process, but ultimately it's the commission, this independent commission, that would decide the outcome. Not cabinet, not ministers, but this commission based on the evidence placed before it. And again, that's not my idea, that was the expert panel's idea. I happen to think it's the right idea in the right direction. So that was what was laid at the feet of the federal government earlier this year. And as I say, we like the expert panel's recommendations. It was music to our ears. Unfortunately, that music died in June 2017 when we saw the discussion paper. And as you can see, the discussion paper essentially rejected the advice provided by the expert panel. The discussion paper says the commission still should be at the helm of environmental assessment processes in the nuclear context. And the EA decisions will still be made by politicians, either minister, ministers, or cabinet. So essentially the status quo, as far as I can tell. That gives rise to a number of concerns, a number of questions, a number of problems. I think Anna already mentioned the first one. You go through the discussion paper stem to stern, there's not, the word sustainability doesn't appear, not even once, even though it was the centerpiece of the expert panel's recommendations, and it was the centerpiece of a lot of public submissions to the panel and to the government of the day, and yet not there at all. So I'm wondering where it's going to show up, if at all. Another concern is if you're going to keep the commission in the game and co-leading or co-conducting EAs, well, maybe it's time for a hard, long look at the commission and its constituent legislation as well. There was, an expert panel that was set up to review the National Energy Board. We didn't get that in the nuclear context. I don't know why. We've been crying out for that kind of a review for a long period of time. And in fact, as recently as last year, CELA and a dozen other environmental groups wrote to the federal government saying, okay, we've now got a 20-year-old nuclear statute. It's time for some parliamentary scrutiny and some public review. I'm not sure we got an answer to that, but we certainly didn't get it in the discussion paper. No commitment to actually review the underlying licensing regime. And it continues. This is, at the most fundamental level, I'm still scratching my head. If the whole object of the exercise is to restore public trust, well, how do you do that by keeping in this life cycle regulator that the expert panel found had no public trust? So how do you do that? How do you accomplish that? I just find it's an extremely circular and confusing argument that's being made in the discussion paper. Another concern is if we do make baby steps kind of progress towards implementing a sustainability regime at the federal level, well, again, that raises question about how well or how effectively the commission is going to be able to discharge that obligation. They haven't been doing sustainability assessments ever. And I recall in one of my submissions to the federal government, we made reference to a transcript excerpt where a CNSC representative admitted, well, we don't do sustainability. That's not in our statute. We look to other agencies and departments to do that, to which I say, well, when's that start? So I'm not sure if we're going to move to a sustainability-based regime. Again, is the commission really, as it's currently constituted, is that the best agency to be administering this? And then finally, there's a nagging question, okay, what nuclear projects actually should be subject to federal environmental assessment? If you have occasion to look at the regulatory list, it's limited to what I would call the mega projects, proposals to build new reactors, new power reactors, or expand them by 50% capacity. It applies to, new or expanded uranium mines and mills, those kinds of big things. But other types of, I would say, environmentally significant proposals like refurbishing existing reactors and extending their life by another 10 or 20 or 30 years, that's got some economic and social and cultural and biophysical ecological implications. And yet under the current list, that's not caught. That's not caught. That does not trigger environmental assessment under the new regime. I think to its credit, the federal government is committed to reviewing and perhaps redrafting or expanding the projects list under CA 2012. Well, I would say there's lots of room for improvement in terms of designating other types of nuclear projects that warrant some form of environmental assessment. I guess I'll finish on this point, the last bullet point. There has been a tendency, a rather distressing tendency by the Commission itself to call what it does under the Nuclear Safety Control Act as environmental assessment. It's not environmental assessment. They don't get into questions of need and alternatives to and all the rest of it. It's licensing, and it's important. It's good to have, an experienced regulatory authority administering a licensing regime, but that's not environmental assessment. So to my mind, the discussion paper put out by the federal government has it wrong. We need to, I think, in some way implement the very sound and forward-looking recommendations of the expert panel. So that's what I'm going to finish on, and I look forward to our continued dialogue. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Rick. I think that was very insightful, and I think kind of captured in many ways certainly the response I was seeing BNSC's role and its credibility as a regulator from a public perspective from those who've interacted with it. Adam's going to help me with the transition as we're now going to go to, we're going to switch gears slightly, but not completely. I'm going to go to Emma. That the C38 and the subsequent sort of conversations, although they were primarily focused on environmental assessment, they also dealt with two other very important dimensions of federal environmental law dealing with water. And specifically, those were what used to be the Navigable Waters Protection Act has now become the Navigation Protection Act. And secondly, the Fisheries Act. And they were included in the review process, though both were subject to parliamentary reviews as opposed to expert panels, and were included in the government's discussion paper. So we're sort of waiting to see where that stage goes. And it was in that context I've asked Emma Liu to, who is the water campaigner with the Council of Canadians, and who has been following the Navigation Protection Act, Navigable Waters Protection Act dimension of this story since it started, to give us an update on where that conversation is now at and where it might be heading next. Emma.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. And I just want to thank the Sustainable Energy Initiative at York U for inviting me. I'm excited to be presenting again alongside the other speakers, and great presentations so far from Anna, Aaron, and Rick. I'm calling in from Ottawa, which is unceded Algonquin territory. And as Mark mentioned, I'm just going to give an overview of where the discussion is on the Navigable Waters Protection Act, or now what's named the Navigation Protection Act. I'm going to talk about
slides you want to share, or are you?
I don't actually.
Okay, very good.
I'm just going to speak. I'm going to give an overview of the Standing Committee's recommendations, and then how the Trudeau government responded. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we want to see in order for the government to be able to protect communities' rights to navigate waterways and to protect navigable waters themselves. So as mentioned, 5 years ago, the former Harper government had passed Bill C-38, and alongside that, it also passed Bill C-45, which included the changes on the Navigable Waters Protection Act. It did a lot of things to that act, including changing the name of the act. Many people know it removed protections from 99% of lakes and rivers, and then it also exempted major pipeline and power line projects from review under that act. So by removing protections from 99% of the lakes and rivers, it meant that projects like fish farms, dams, mining projects, and other projects that would be built on all but the scant list of the 97 lakes, 62 rivers, and 3 oceans that were under the schedule list of protected waterways. Everything else wouldn't be reviewed for their impacts on navigation and navigable waters. So you likely remember this move really outraged Indigenous nations and groups. It's what sparked the Idle No More movement. Environmental groups and prominent Canadians such as David Suzuki spoke out about this. Musicians like Sarah Harmer and the late Gord Downey, who many of you know was a huge advocate for water protection, spoke out about this. And so since then, the Liberals campaign platform, and Mark had mentioned this earlier on, committed to doing a review of these changes, restoring lost protections, and then incorporating more modern safeguards. So the review happened last year. So it was put to the Standing Committee on Transport, Communities, and Infrastructure, and they heard presentations last fall. There were in total 17 presenters, and it was a mix of different types of presenters. For Indigenous folks, it was the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, or the Métis, and the Métis National Council. For the NGO perspective, there was Paddle Canada, the Fraser Basin Council. I presented on behalf of the Council of Canadians. There was also the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. And then there were also a number of municipal associations. So there were the Alberta Association of Municipal Districts and Counties. There was Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, industry associations such as the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, Association and the Canadian Construction Association, and then also the Ministry of Transport as well. And so it was by invite. I'm not sure how they selected the presenters or what the committee did with folks who requested to present. I didn't have a great experience in presenting to the standing committee. I actually was invited to present twice because the first time that I presented, one of the committee members introduced a motion to actually not hear any more presentations or testimony from groups like mine or from presenters. And so the time that I was participating in the first hearing, most of the hearing was taken up by the committee members debating this motion. So I was quite troubled by that, and so I complained about it, and they did invite me back, and I was able to present my concerns again, but it didn't make for a great start to the public consultation process. The standing committee also, so alongside the presentations, the in-person presentations, or I guess video conference presentations, they also received written submissions, so there was more than 250 submissions, and it's interesting to look at the who made written submissions. So there was actually quite strong representation from indigenous nations and indigenous groups. There was about 66 written submissions, so about a quarter of them were from indigenous nations and groups. There were a few from industry groups like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association. There was about 30 NGOs, and about probably half of the written submissions were by individuals. There were also government and municipal associations, and I'd say most of the submissions were calling for all lakes and rivers to be protected under the Act again. Many of the submissions called for Indigenous authority and jurisdiction to be recognized. So these are just some of the things that the Council of Canadians have been calling for. We have a campaign called the Every Lake, Every River campaign, where we're calling on the Trudeau government to put protections back on all of the lakes and rivers. So after the standing committee hearings and then the comment period was over, the standing committee launched their recommendations in March of this year. It was actually the day after World Water Day, which is March 22nd. There was 11 recommendations, and even though it was the day after World Water Day, the recommendations didn't do very well in terms of protecting water. So that I mentioned there were 11 recommendations. The very first one talked about how the standing committee thought that the protection should actually be left off of the 99% of lakes and rivers. And instead it called for improving the process for adding waterways to the schedule, and then a public awareness campaign that should be put in place to inform communities or stakeholders about this process. There were also a couple of recommendations that advised the government to clarify who can ask for a waterway to be added to the schedule of navigable waters, and on what grounds, and then that Transport Canada explain why a waterway should or shouldn't be added. So this is a concern for us because it puts the onus on the public to make the case to put protections on their local lake or river or other waterway, when really we feel it's the federal government's responsibility to protect waterways for current generations and for future generations. And then, perhaps cynical of me, but the recommendations that talk about who can request that waterways be added and on what grounds seems to be softening the ground for Transport Canada to deny some protections in some cases. But remains to be seen, and we'll see what the criteria is in terms of the federal government even getting community consent on this criteria and what that's going to be. So the recommendations also addressed Indigenous treaty and water rights. I mentioned there were the written briefs from Indigenous nations, and all said that they had not been properly consulted, and without free, prior, and informed consent, the Navigation Protection Act may actually violate Indigenous treaty and water rights. There were concerns raised that traditional waterways were no longer protected. It was a lack of clarity on how these waterways could be considered for addition to the Act's schedule, and the Act didn't or doesn't adequately consider that for Indigenous people, navigation by water is needed for subsistence, commerce, transportation, and traditional cultural practices. And because 99% of lakes and rivers are left unprotected, many Indigenous nations they simply don't know that projects are happening on waterways that are in their traditional territories. So the Standing Committee recommended that the government look at ways of preserving, protecting, and respecting navigation on waterways that are on traditional Indigenous territories, and that they recognize the special relationship that Indigenous nations or Indigenous communities have, and that they are properly informed about projects that may start. So the recommendation, quite general. In terms of the recommendations on pipelines and power lines, the Standing Committee talked about Transport Canada being included in the decision-making on environmental assessments for pipelines and power lines, but it's unclear whether that's going to be on the short list of navigable waters, or what's considered to be navigable waters, and then also whether like how Transport Canada is going to be included in that process. The recommendations also talked about the test for navigability. So it used to be that navigability was determined by the canoe test. So if a canoe could be floated on a body of water, the waterway was declared navigable. And then the former government significantly narrowed this by introducing the idea of the aqueous highway test. So whether a waterway had significant navigable traffic in the past, present, or future. And then a concern was that this didn't include recreational activities, and then also left out what I listed in terms of how Indigenous peoples use waterways as well. There were complaints from municipalities about related to this, that things like culverts or small bridges were taking 2 or more years to process, and that was some of the arguments of the municipal associations, that they actually wanted the short list of waterways kept in place because it was impacting these other projects. And then just want to be clear that our concern is not with these smaller projects, but some of the bigger ones like the pipelines or the dams or fish farms or mining projects that are having serious impacts on these waterways, that there needs to be some sort of process to trigger an adequate review of the impact on waterways. So the recommendation was just further consultation, and the discussion paper talked a little bit about clarifying the criteria used for the aqueous highway test in determining whether a water was navigable or not. The recommendations also talked about a complaints process, that Transport Canada create some sort of administrative complaint mechanism that would assist the public with possible impediments to navigation for waterways that weren't listed in the schedule, or that officers of the Navigation Protection Program be able to accept and address complaints. So this would give communities the ability to oppose projects or to raise concerns about projects that put waterways at risk. This is a positive recommendation, but it matters whether or not there's enough staff capacity, as some of the Navigation Protection Program offices are quite stretched already. And then it remains to be seen how Transport Canada will decide on complaints or concerns about the project, or about projects. And then also it'll be important on whether or not the government provides adequate funding for there to be enough staff or whatnot to be able to hear these complaints and to be able to make the complaints process meaningful. So in response to this, the Trudeau government put out response the Transport Minister did in June, and they said they mostly agreed with the committee's recommendations. In some cases, they said that they go beyond that, especially when it comes to increasing participation of Indigenous groups. And some of the general points that I mentioned with the recommendations were also highlighted in the discussion paper as well. So Transport Canada said they also sought views of Indigenous groups and Canadians in addition to what the Standing Committee did. In terms of the 99% of lakes and rivers that were not protected, they said that they'd engage with Indigenous groups, governments, and stakeholders on changes to improve the process of adding navigable waters to the schedule, and this was supposed to happen through the summer. And then there'd be a communication strategy to educate people on this process. In regards to pipelines and power lines, there wasn't a clear commitment from the Trudeau government to put pipeline or power line reviews for these reviews for waterways back into the Navigation Protection Act. And in Transport Canada's response, they said that their involvement would depend on what happened with SIA and the NAB Act reviews. They generally supported a complaints process, and they actually proposed creating a public registry for proposed works that are subject to the Navigation Protection Act. So this could be a positive step forward in terms of having an online registry, but it matters whether or not they are just going to include the projects that are triggered or fall under the list of the short list of protected waterways, or if it's going to be any lake and river that is going to be impacted by a project. In terms of Indigenous treaty and water rights, the government said they'd consult with First Nations and other stakeholders. As I mentioned, this process was supposed to happen throughout the summer, but you may have seen the Globe article not that long ago where an Indigenous leader sent a letter to the Trudeau government, or Prime Minister Trudeau, saying the government's commitment of working in partnership and on a nation-to-nation basis is not being met. It was 3 regional chiefs who were the co-chairs of the Assembly of First Nations Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment that sent this letter, and so quite a strongly worded letter, and very concerned that that they're not being properly involved in the process. So there was also another letter that was sent a few weeks ago on the 5th anniversary of when Bill C-45 was passed. That was, I believe that was October 9th. And there were more than 60 groups and Indigenous nations that sent this letter, or that signed this letter, calling on Trudeau to restore protections on all lakes and rivers. The letter called for not just that, but also that there be consideration of environmental factors in decision-making about navigable waters, recognizing that waterways are not just an economic highway, but part of natural heritage. Also reinstating federal scrutiny of pipelines and power lines, and making sure to incorporate co-governance with Indigenous nations, recognizing their authority and jurisdiction over waterways on their traditional territories. We support the idea of a public registry to facilitate consultation that fosters true collaboration between communities and the government. Also calling for the implementation of strict safeguards for waterways within the framework of the UN recognized human right to water and sanitation. And then also recognize that the government manages navigable waters subject to public trust principles for current and future generations, and then also applying a precautionary approach in regulating any of the projects that threaten public or Indigenous rights to navigation and associated environmental values. So I'm just going to wrap up now. I may have talked a little bit fast because I tend to do that, but I have the notes from this presentation if anybody wants the details. But I do think this is a key moment, and this is an opportunity for the Trudeau government to fill its election promises. And as Anna said, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So it's very important that the Trudeau government puts strong protections on all lakes and rivers and waterways. And I just want to point to a couple examples that are happening internationally that you may have seen. It was shortly after the Standing Committee put out their week recommendations in March, but New Zealand granted the Wanganui River, I don't know if I'm saying that right, the same legal rights as a human being. And then a few days later, India also legally recognized the Yamuna and Ganges rivers as living entities. So these are amazing and very inspiring examples of how some governments are implementing legislation and giving rights to waterways to have them protected. These are very historic decisions, and so what we're needing to see to protect lakes and rivers. So, and it's this kind of visionary and bold action that we hope the Trudeau government will take in the coming months to protect all lakes and rivers across the regions. Thank you.
Emma, thank you very much. That's a very dense but very information-packed presentation, and I hadn't fully grasped where this conversation had got to. I think the Indigenous dimension is I think particularly interesting in the extent to which you can reconcile what the government has done here with the protection of traditional uses. I think is a very complicated question. We want to think about it some more. Our speaker today is Martin Olchinski, who is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. And I've asked Martin to speak both about where the other component of this conversation is around the review of the Fisheries Act, which was another piece of legislation rewritten through Bill C-38. And I've also invited Martin as sort of the academic on the panel to perhaps hit a little bit of cleanup if he's inclined to do so as well. Martin's very well positioned to comment on this. He was on the counsel with the Department of Justice, and I practiced in particular with legal services at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. He's also spent time on secondment with Legislative and Regulatory Affairs with Environment Canada, and it's on that basis that I'm going to invite him to speak a little bit about where the conversation about the Fisheries Act in particular seems to be heading, where it's at, and where it seems to be heading. Martin.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Mark, and thank you, everybody. Pleasure to join you today and speak to this issue. So I'm gonna review just quickly sort of the main events, guideposts, milestones in this process, and then I'm gonna spend some time. At the last webinar that we had like this, I did have an opportunity to discuss a little bit the Parliamentary Committee report. It had just come out, I think, the day or two before. I'll go there. Then we'll talk a little bit more about DFO's own consultation activities, the discussion paper, what I think, my overall impressions about where things have gone so far, and I might even take the risky task of sort of speculating about what at least I sort of am expecting to see in the bills that come out on the Fisheries Act front. And then, as Mark mentioned, I'll try to spend a little bit of time drawing at least some of these different parts together, and on that front, it mostly sort of the relationship or lack thereof between the sort of impact assessment regime and that review together with the NPA and Fisheries Act reviews, and maybe some other sort of gaps that we noticed sort of as things have been moving along, because there's been so many, I think, parts here. So I'll spend a bit of time on that. So of course, what started all of this is the 2015 Liberal campaign promises around restoring lost protections. That was, I think, a fairly important plank in the federal Liberal campaign, the environmental sort of vote. And then we saw fairly quickly that manifesting itself into sort of concrete sort of directives. So we had the mandate letter to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and to the Minister of Transport, and essentially saying, look, we need to look at those 2012 changes that were introduced in the omnibus legislation to restore those lost protections. But at the same time, a quick nod to this notion of incorporating modern safeguards. And so the idea that we weren't just going to be looking back, but maybe we should be looking ahead and seeing what can we do with these acts on a go-forward basis. And that's maybe taking a bit of a Pollyanna view on my part. But I think it is important to recognize that a lot of these laws, were primed for a significant review in any event, I think, around 2012. Certainly the Fisheries Act, essentially introduced in 1977, the prohibition against impacts to fish habitat. The NPA being a long-standing, then the Navigable Waters Protection Act being a long-standing piece of legislation as well. Environmental assessment we'd had for almost 20 years at that point. Clearly there were lessons that we'd learned along the way. And so really 2012 was just like a huge, underwhelming sort of disappointment, right? Because it took us the opposite direction that we needed to go. So, for my part anyways, and I think several other participants in this process along the way, it's been important to not just think about this as undoing the 2012 changes, but really undertaking that sort of broader review that could be based on essentially essentially lessons learned from the past 30 years of environmental law. And so that's something that I'll come back to at the end. So in any event, the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans issued its report early in this year, around February, and then, of course, the government discussion paper in June over the summer. With respect to the Standing Committee's review, again, just a quick screenshot, and everybody can go there. And so we had roughly 50 witnesses presenting at the committee, over 180 briefs from all kinds of groups, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that again towards the end of this part of the discussion. But in any event, they're all all that evidence and all those briefs are available, and those can all be accessed through FOPO's website. In terms of, again, the Standing Committee's report, I think is actually reasonably well written. I think there are some things that are missing, and some things that are touched on maybe just a little bit too quickly. But some of the main takeaways. Of course, probably the largest one, the most significant, a return to the prohibition against HAD, right? So the excision of the 2012 serious harm to fish regime. And so as a part of that, the notion of permanent alteration and destruction, that's the whole, the idea that, the committee basically said we need to jettison that. The idea that only certain fish matter, Aboriginal fisheries, commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, jettisoning that concept, recognizing that all fish have some value in this system. Greater clarity at the same time about what then will constitute a HAD, and this seemed like a very clear response to the certain sectors in particular who appeared before the committee. I want to say the municipal sector, agricultural sector, certainly in somewhat of a surprise actually. Some of these sectors were supportive of the overall review and suggesting that maybe those 2012 changes that they might have been inclined to support back then haven't worked out quite exactly like they would have thought, but certainly still being being weary, I think, of this idea. It was a bit of a myth, but maybe some anecdotes behind it as well. That that the previous prohibition was overly broad and that I was inhibiting all kinds of development, including important public infrastructure. Another big one was increased resources. So we know, of course, that with the changes to the law also came a massive reduction in DFO's budget, hundreds of millions of dollars. And then this was, again, very interesting to hear not just NGOs or academics and scientists complain about lack of resources, but actually the very sectors that required these authorizations, whether it was the municipalities or mining, saying, look, we have no one to talk to anymore. We can't get advice. We can't get help with our projects. And this is actually a hindrance for us. And then the other one, which I think a lot of people are pushing along in the spirit of sort of more transparency and accountability, is the idea that, that there should be an online registry that contains authorizations under the Act. This is kind of standard practice, I think, at the provincial level. Not to say that it's best practice, but in any event, certainly we can learn from some of our provincial departments. And then also a broader, sort of more rigorous monitoring of fish habitat in Canada. So this is sort of the, and this again where I say, that this process hasn't been limited just to the 2012 changes, but rather going broader and really asking some fundamental questions. And it just, this is the sort of unfortunate state of affairs that, 20 years, 30 years after the policy for fish habitat in 1986, where we announced, the government said, we're committing to a net gain in Canada of fish habitat, and that as a part of that, we're going to ensure that there's no net loss on a project by project basis. And the fact that the department still has no sense, no data, no credible sense of what the status of fish habitat is in Canada. And so the idea that we'd have a registry, a database for not just authorizations, but monitoring data, and as well, so someone taking that information and putting it together so that we can see the forest from the trees. At the same time, as the committee was doing its work, DFO was also engaged in consultation efforts, and these were mostly done, I think, online. I know they probably had meetings in Ottawa and around Canada, but they were also actively involved. I think this is a general trend for this government anyways, of trying to use collaborative web-based tools to get public feedback on proposals. And I'm not going to spend much time here except to say that they generally, when you participated in these workbooks and these different online platforms, they tended to mirror the conversation at the committee level. They tended to mirror the conversation, at least that I was having and was observing online. And as between various groups, so that, again, the idea of returning to the HAD prohibition, the idea of an online registry, the idea of more nimble enforcement tools. That one, unfortunately, I haven't seen picked up sort of more broadly, but certainly a discussion around administrative monetary penalties and those issues with enforcement and all that kind of stuff. And so those were there, and those were done in 2 stages. There was a first review consultation that happened during the parliamentary committee, essentially, and then a second phase that happened essentially shortly after the government's discussion paper came out. And again, I tried to see if I could go back into my own sort of participation and pull up some of the questions. Unfortunately, they're closed. But again, it tended to reflect very much the conversation that was being had at the committee level and also sort of in social media and around Canada. So then the fabled Government of Canada discussion paper, and so we've all already heard about this discussion paper, the pros and the cons. I mean, as a general principle, the Fisheries Act and the Navigation Protection Act got the shortest shrift here. But again, consistent with, I think, some of the other observations, the words generally and the general ideas were right. Questions about details, questions about what this would look like legislatively, whether it was going to actually be enforceable or whether we were going to be relying on the good faith sort of commitments of government. And so I've just cut and pasted here sort of like directly from the discussion paper some of the main themes. So partnering with Indigenous peoples, I think many people were pleased to see that. So of course, it's just a question of what that's going to look like on the ground. Planning and integrated management, the idea recognizing, again, that, DFO policy since 1986 has recognized that fish habitat and the management of fish habitat needs to be integrated or should be integrated into broader land use, watershed planning activities. And so again, where we see that everything old is new again. So the question is, of course, back then these were matters of policy and they were not really done, they were not implemented. Will the government demonstrate some learning in this next round and put some of this stuff into legislation so that we can actually force some of it to happen? More partnering and collaboration. Again, I think an important point, the idea of a collaborative committee to advise on fish and fish habitat, that's essentially straight out of the parliamentary committee report. So I think that we're going to see that, the idea that this needs to be a little bit less, I think one of the things that comes out of the parliamentary report is the idea that this has been a contentious field for a long time. And certainly I think, DFO officials have had a fairly difficult time in certain communities, in certain contexts, sort of enforcing the law against, ideas and guffaws and bewilderment by, let's say, other sectors, as if to say that these things, fish and fish habitat aren't important and why are we holding things up? And so I think a recognition that there needs to be better communication and collaboration between the various rights holders and stakeholders, and we'll see where that goes. And then, of course, finally, the point that I made earlier about reporting back to Canadians, so providing a transparent access to information about projects and impacts of fish and fish habitat. And so a registry of some kind, as well as an assessment, ongoing assessment of the state of fish and fish habitat in Canada. So so general impressions, what can we say about this? I think I want to echo a little bit what Emma said. I mean, there were certainly times when the parliamentary review was partisan, overtly partisan, and things got a little bit, I think, heated, unnecessarily so, but that's the nature of the beast, I think, the fact that we had a conservative government that had introduced the 2012 changes, and now we had a liberal government that was essentially, shedding light on all of them and all the problems. It was maybe not too surprising to see that some members in the opposition would take issue with that, but that was how it was. But I think overall, at least the fisheries committee review was probably less contentious than the Navigation Protection Act review on a whole. I think that one of the things that's remarkable is the strong uniformity in recommendations amongst NGOs. And on this front, I think, certainly leadership from West Coast Environmental, Eco-Justice. I should add here WWF Canada, who had obviously a huge role and has, I think, a significant influence with their work around watershed reports and what that can look like online. So I apologize to my friends at WWF right now that I don't have their name on there. I think also what was great, we saw a lot of collaboration in the academic world between not just so we didn't just have submissions from environmental lawyers and legal academics, but also from science. So, lots of great work being done over at Summit Fraser, Brett Favreau over in Newfoundland, and Memorial, bringing forward the scientific sort of perspective, and in some cases in most cases those just working really well. I was surprised to see again, and I alluded to this earlier, there was also that consensus with certain other sectors on certain issues around, for instance, the wording of Section 35, recognizing that it perhaps is not as clear as it could have been and that it's created some confusion, and the issue of departmental of departmental capacity. So the idea that, you actually, if you want a program to run effectively, you need people on the other side of the phone, and perhaps even more shocking, that you need boots on the ground. And so that's something that certainly I think was made. The point was made pretty clearly. So in terms of expectations, I don't think I'm going to say anything radical here. I return to the HAD. I think some provisions for an online registry, increased collaboration. So I think that committee should have a legislative basis. And then I can't actually see what the rest of my slide says right now because my own face is in the middle of it. But I think, essentially a lot of stuff. I don't think, I guess I would say I would be surprised if the bill that comes forward departs radically from the work of the parliamentary committee and the collaborative work, the online sort of consultation work that DFO did. It seems like everybody was sort of, pardon the expression, but rowing in the same direction on this stuff. And so I'm sort of expecting that to continue. But of course, I've been wrong before and I can be wrong again. So then the last piece is just this idea of so what is the relationship between all of these different pieces? And that was something I think that a lot of the participants in this process kept trying to keep an eye on and kept trying to hope and nudge the government towards making sure that it's thinking about. And so I'm thinking about whether that's, in submissions before the EA panel, submissions before the parliamentary committees. Are you keeping an eye on the ball? Are you thinking about how these pieces are all going to work together? We know that under the previous SIA model, of course, the Fisheries Act and the Navigation Protection Act were fundamental parts of that system. They were the mainstay triggers for environmental assessment. So are we going back to that kind of system? And if we're not going back to that kind of system, what are the alternatives? And so several of us got together and decided, based on when the discussion paper came out, and I think we had the reaction that many others did, which is to say that there were some good things in there, but a lot of ambiguity and then some things missing. We tried to respond to that by sort of filling in the gaps and proposing some ideas for how to tie those things together, tie certain parts together, and at the same time also address issues that seem to us to have sort of fallen off the table. And one of those near and dear to my own heart, for instance, is the concept of adaptive management and the role that it was having. And so we wanted to put pen to paper and put some ideas out so that the government could see at least what some of this might look like in practice. And so I'm not gonna review the whole thing. I think on one of these slides I provide a link to the piece, so anyone and everyone are welcome to go take a look at that. I did want to play here, just put out here, for instance, just sort of, I think, the underlying principles and perspectives that informed our position, and we were trying to just reiterate what we thought was really important The first one, of course, is the longstanding inadequacy of federal environmental laws. So this is really to make the point that, this is not about tweaking, and it shouldn't, and it's not about a minor adjustment here and there. The fact that, I think that it's not an exaggeration to say that the federal environmental system is broken. It is fundamentally broken and inadequate. There's simply no way anyone could say that our regulators have access to the kind of information that they require in order to make good decisions about projects and about the environment more generally. Nor can we say that there's the kind of oversight and accountability that we would require from any kind of sort of credible regulatory system. And so we were just trying to really reiterate that point, to reiterate the point that the environment and that the economy, and as well as sort of social and cultural issues, all need to be weighed and considered together. And that the lesson, in fact, in the past 10 years is that when you try to privilege one, and I think we can say that there was a privileging of the economic development, you're not going to get yourself ahead. And in fact, we see that you are going to potentially, create all kinds of uncertainty for industry when those development approvals are challenged in court or in the court of public opinion. Another big one, information gathering and learning. And so this is, again, one that I feel like needs to be stressed very strongly. We need to see our regulators gathering the kind of information that they require in terms of ambient environmental conditions, as well as sort of the specific impacts of various projects, seeing how all of that is working and affecting the environment, but large projects and small. And so that was one of the things that we really tried to tackle in this submission, is how would we do that? And Emma alluded to this before, and the transport folks have talked about a registration system in the context of the NPA, and we say that for us, if we're not going to return to a trigger position, sort of trigger-based regime as under the old SIA, then there needs to at the very least be a sort of broad registration requirement for we'll call them sort of minor projects, whether that's under the Fisheries Act, under the Navigable Waters Protection Act, or Navigation Protection Act. We already have a registry under SARA. All these registries would be combined in sort of a central national registry that would provide information about projects, their environmental effects, and the analysis around that. Sort of trying to hit that sweet spot between ensuring that the regulators have the information they need, but at the same time recognizing that there are going to be demands for efficiency and streamlining, and that we have to sort of try to help government find that sweet spot. And then finally, the point about constrained decision making, and this seems to be one that we've had to come back to over and over again. It's just the idea that, under any kind of credible system, there can't just be a carte blanche decision at the end that allows government to essentially make whatever decision it wants. And that's not the norm in other legal contexts, and I think we used an example, and I certainly have, referring to the charter, and the constraints that the charter imposes on us. Or we might think about the way we separate various functions in government, because we recognize that there are tendencies that can be counterproductive. And so similarly, in the environmental law context, we need to ensure that there is constraints on decision making to guard against well-established biases, again, for instance, towards short-term economic and political gain. And so I think actually I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm not going to get into the details. I threw on this slide sort of the outline. You can see essentially we talked about the Fisheries Act, the Navigation Protection Act, and then we tie it into the new Canadian Impact Assessment Act. I think one of the big ones again is the idea of registration. So there, certain projects will require an environmental assessment. I think most of us assume that the government's looking at a project list type regime. And so if that's the case, then what to do with all those projects that are not on the project list? And so this is where we say a registration system is required. Of course, the most recent audit coming out of the Environmental Commission of Ontario is very relevant on that front. Some important lessons there about what this kind of registration system might look like, what the potential vulnerabilities are, and how those need to be addressed. So I think I will leave it there. I think you've all been listening for a long time, so I'll hand it back over to Mark now.
Thanks, Martin. That's great. That's again very informative and a very good kind of roll up of some of the issues that sort of are left on the table and that we're kind of looking for answers to. We've got a couple of minutes left. We're going to wrap at 3 o'clock for questions. I'm going to sort of move directly there. If Adam had the chat box in front of me for a second, so I need that back. While we're figuring that, I'm going to see if there are any questions for our panel in the room. Chris Hummel over there. You need to press the red button.
Great. Thanks to all the panelists. I just wanted to, I don't actually have this question directed to anyone in particular, but are there any other jurisdictions or countries in the world who have a sort of model framework for EA that you can point to say this is what we wish Canada's looked more like?
I'll take a stab at answering that, and just really shortly, not really. There are pieces of legislation from other areas of the world that have elements of EA that are done well, but to my knowledge, there's no other jurisdiction that's really doing this next gen EA work the way we're proposing it.
And let me just jump in on that. I think Anna's right. We are looking for the creation of a bold new statute with a focus on sustainability. But in terms of models in other jurisdictions, I have to say that I'm old enough to remember the good old days of environmental assessment here in Ontario, back when our provincial EA process was regarded as the strongest and most robust process in the whole country, when we used to have hearings before an independent tribunal, now called the Environmental Review Tribunal, where evidence was, put under oath, and there was cross-examinations, and there was intervener funding. Those were the good old days, and if we could get some of that built into the federal process, I think that's good. I think there are lessons to be learned from what we used to have here in Ontario, but I hasten to add, as much as we need reform at the federal level, we also need reform of our provincial process that's fallen on hard times lately as well.
I'll throw in that in our submission, and in some of our follow-up meetings with the minister, as she has been going around the country meeting with various groups, parts of the Australian and New Zealand regimes have elements that we notice are sort of in line with some of what we've talked about, but not 100%. It doesn't get exactly to where you need to go, but there are nods towards sustainability assessments in those jurisdictions. We actually also have spent a fair amount of time talking about Quebec and the BAP process in Quebec, and that there are, in fact, again, it's not perhaps a perfect application, but they use sustainability, roughly what you might call a sustainability checklist at one point in that process, that certainly provides at least a starting point for having these conversations, and to recognize, I think, which something that we've all tried to do is to sort of say, that and we're talking about something new under the sun for sure, but we're not saying that, we're not talking about anything radical or some kind of radical departure from things that have been done and are being done successfully in other jurisdictions. So it's really just a question of collating those things together.
Much of these things exist somewhere in some form. I mean, the trick is, I'm always telling my students, you never want to tell a Canadian politician they'd be the first to do something. That causes them to hide under the table. But there are things we can draw from the Ontario. So certainly when we had the decision-making embedded with the assessment board, for example, I mean, the trade-off, I think, was time, but on the other hand, complexity of process. But at the end of the day, we probably got much better decisions, which in hindsight, we kind of realized were the right decisions, looking back, which we may not have realized at the time. A couple of questions coming in online. One for Martin, actually, is from Alex Mallet at Carleton, and asking you can give an example of what you mean by a nimble enforcement tool.
Yeah, so the reference here, I think the one that I'm thinking about most is this notion of administrative monetary penalties. So right now under the Fisheries Act, unfortunately, and I see that somebody has posted, Jay Waring has indicated that there is currently a national strategy for discussing ticketing fisheries violations. And so to unpackage this a bit, I mean, the problem right now under the Fisheries Act is that if you violate a term or a condition of your authorization, or if you just are in violation, contravention of the prohibition against harm to fish, the only tool that the government has is a prosecution. I mean, it has lesser enforcement tools like warnings and inspection orders, but in terms of sort of hitting you with, in a tangible, concrete way against your pocketbook, fundamentally, then it's really just a prosecution or nothing. And in my view, that's just entirely, all of that machinery, our prosecution service and approach to this stuff is just not geared in a way where that makes sense for a department that's strapped for resources. And also, let's be honest, like I don't know that it's best value in terms of, if we think about all the machinery that's required to take a defender to court. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So for those lesser offenses, the ones that don't require and won't generate $1 million fines, I think it would be a huge boost, and I think we could see it being used effectively so that fisheries officers can issue tickets, essentially. There's some, now that might seem like a very straightforward sort of solution, but in fact at the federal level, because of the division of powers and how all that kind of stuff works, there had to be some thinking for a long time about whether or not the federal government could issue tickets, essentially monetary tickets, penalties for breaches of these regulatory statutes. But that work's been done. Environment Canada has now introduced what they call the EVAMPA, Environmental Violations Administrative Monetary Penalties Act or something like that. And it's an omnibus legislation that they were then able to wrap in a bunch of their own statutes in. And so I think there's really no reason why on a go-forward basis, the Fisheries Act couldn't also be amended to include these monetary penalty provisions. And I'll say that it's a point that I think I've made, certainly, and others have made. We haven't seen it being picked up by the government, except for now, again, like I say, I'll be checking out this website right away, because apparently there is now a consultations on ticketing fisheries violations.
Next question from online from Cheryl, and this is an easy one. A question about sustainability, and it's for the panel. Why did the government discussion paper duck the question of sustainability? Why is the government not want to go there in terms of that as the determinative criteria? Is it too complicated? And also requested, we have some examples of where it has been applied in assessment processes. So thoughts on why did the government want to avoid the sustainability question in the discussion paper?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at that again. So it's a good question. And in meetings that I have had with government, I was told that there were certain members of the team that were working on the discussion paper that don't like the term sustainability because it's been so misused over the years and doesn't have a lot of trust. And so I think it was not because they didn't have an intention to aim towards sustainability, but because they felt like the term effectively lacks any kind of meaning. So in subsequent meetings, we've been assured on a number of occasions that they do intend to have a sustainability approach in the legislation. But I think more importantly, your question about it potentially being too complicated is really accurate. So the issues that I raised in my presentation before, where they're saying they're going to put all these things into the basket to consider, it looks like they're still going in that direction. So they'll have a bunch of factors to consider, but no decision-making criteria or rules to guard against unwanted trade-offs in the legislation. And I do think that is a lot more complicated and could be one of the barriers to why we haven't been more successful in getting that in legislative proposals.
Other thoughts on this? This is more than the government of Canada can get its mind around at this stage. And
Yep. Mark, if I can just, I guess, partly I think the problem here is unfortunately the way that this stuff is done. I don't know, lately it's trendy. I keep hearing people referring to elevator pitches. So this is the famous sort of notion, right, that you have, that in government, if you have an idea, you catch a minister or deputy minister in an elevator, and if you can pitch an idea to them in 5 seconds or whatever long you're in the elevator with them with, you might get some traction and it'll make its way up. But of course, so the sustainability discussion, unfortunately, is just not amenable to a 20-second pitch, I think. And I think that's certainly part of my experience, is that there are a lot of parts here, and you almost need a different kind of consultation process, one that ensures that the relevant expertise is at the table, but then also I think you really need knowledge brokers who are able to then translate that knowledge, distill it down to sort of to concepts and notions that a broader, more lay audience can understand. And I think that has been a bit of the struggle on this side of things, on the sustainability side.
There's positive response in the room. Anyway, other questions in the room? Okay, and I'll make a. Yep. We're here. Yes. Oh, you need to hit the red button, or otherwise the panel won't be able to hear you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Just a general question. Is there a way we can get this information in a data repository somewhere that we can go back and look at it, like a kind of repository where we have all this information?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. The short answer is yes. We're recording the session. We're going to post it on the Sustainable Energy Initiative website. And I'm also going to invite now the speakers to send us their PowerPoint presentations as well, because we can post those as well. And indeed, we've had a lot of post-event traffic from the previous sessions as well. These have been very useful resources for people thinking about these events. How are we for time? Got one last question. We've got 2 minutes. So I'm going to throw it in before I do my thank yous. That's coming online. And this one is for Aaron. Sorry. And a question, this is one that crossed my mind too, is why did the low greenhouse gas emission strategy not enjoy broader publicity? It seemed to sort of, it passed there, but unless you were paying very close attention or stumbled across it, you would have never known.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, they gave it that horrible name, which sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare and doesn't really sound like instructive, useful policy. So they made it quite boring. They also, when they announced it, it was buried in the UN climate talks last November in Morocco. So it wasn't, I think it had many other competing climate stories around that time of year, so it didn't bubble up as something that was particularly relevant to media, and therefore didn't get a lot of scrutiny. But also, of course, because we've just gone through this massive national consultation and negotiating process to land the Pan-Canadian Framework, which is all about achieving our 2030 target. So I think it's also been competing against a very, a real-time policy negotiation, which has had much more interest, much more scrutiny, and also has yielded true policies and regulations, whereas the mid-century strategy is more about what we could do on a in a far and distant future, and is not so much about today. But we hope to change that. In fact, Pembina is planning to launch a decarbonization series of position papers for each sector, and so we are hoping to elevate the profile of the mid-century strategy and help policymakers think about how they build on our existing climate policy architecture like the PCF, and actually get into those stretch goals for mid-century.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting paper, though it also, at least when I looked at it, it also seemed to raise some very interesting trade-offs as well that we may need to think about in sort of the deeper decarbonization pathways that I don't think have only begun to surface in the conversation, but have yet to be fully articulated. I think we had one last question, and then we're going to need to wrap.
Okay. This is a question for Martin. And my name is Ann Pohl. I'm with the chapter of the Council of Canadians on the East Coast. I've done a lot of work recently on marine life and ocean issues, and I have identified as well in my submissions and other things the whole issue of departmental capacity, and it's huge. And of course, there were many layoffs in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans under the Harper regime, for probably political reasons as well as financial. So, and there wasn't a good database to begin with. So I'm interested in whatever thoughts you might have about how we can work productively to try and convince the government to boost its departmental capacity.
So I think that that's a great question. So thank you for asking it, because it's actually something that I think all of us are thinking about all the time. I mean, fundamentally, I don't know if it's a question, actually. I don't know if it's something to convince the government or the department. I think it's something that you need to convince Canadians of, to be totally honest. And so, there's always, it's very trendy. Every once in a while, we hear about budgets and we hear about deficits. But what's missing is a sort of a national conversation about what government needs to get to do what it needs to do and to get things done. And I think certainly there are nuggets of lessons learned from the DFO experience in terms of what was cut and lost. But I kind of feel like this is one where if the government feels that it has support from Canadians, understanding from Canadians that this is important, that they understand that you can, if you want a department to function well, it needs to be properly resourced. It sounds like a trite sort of maybe thing to say, but that's the reality of it. And I've heard it said in other contexts as well. So I think, certainly to make the point to departments that we recognize that they have a capacity issue and that that people support that, in increasing and improving those resources, I think that's important. But I also would encourage those who have an ear, to have constituencies who are able to address sort of that issue in more public fora, I guess, to make those points, because I think that's really, it's always easy, it's very easy for critics of government spending to sort of say, oh, these deficits are ballooning and this and that. But of course, all of that is deliberate. We have less resources. We had GST cuts. We had all those things which reduced the government sort of budget. And so pushing back on that means articulating in very clear ways that there's value for those dollars, and there can be value for those dollars if it's done right.
Indeed, you can argue the value for those dollars far exceeds the upfront cost very, very strongly. And indeed, to provide necessary capacity within some of these agencies is not a gigantic fiscal issue in the larger scheme of things within the overall scope of federal spending. But on that thought, I think we need to wrap up. We need to give up the space. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Anna, Aaron, Rick, Emma, and Martin, for their very insightful comments on these issues. I certainly learned a lot in terms of where these conversations are at and where they may be going. And I think we have to emphasize the stay tuned part of that, because the legislation in theory is supposed to appear sometime relatively soon, at which stage this becomes very real in terms of what the government actually intends to do. A few other thank yous. I want to thank Adam Jones, who helped us out with all the technical dimensions of things, Susan Morrissey-Wise, and Amanda Gelfand, who helped us here in the room, and Michael O'Reilly, who runs the studio, who's also very helpful.